Nora Voss knocked on my door at 8 in the evening, apologetic and slightly frazzled, holding a dead light fixture from her hallway ceiling like it had personally betrayed her that day. "I'm so sorry to bother you," she said, "but I can't reach the fixture without a ladder, and I don't own one yet, and my daughter's terrified of the dark hallway, and I genuinely don't know a single other person in this neighborhood to ask. I'm Miles Hargrove, 38. I've lived alone in this house for over a decade, long enough to have developed a fairly reliable reputation as the guy who owns tools and doesn't mind lending a hand. A role I'd settled into comfortably over the years without ever fully examining why I'd never built much of a life beyond it. I'd had relationships over the years, nothing that ever quite stuck. A series of reasonable, pleasant connections that never developed into anything permanent, until eventually I'd stopped actively looking and settled into a solitary rhythm that felt, most days, like a choice rather than a default. I fixed things for neighbors, kept a well-organized garage, and told myself the quiet, useful life I'd built was enough, mostly because examining whether it actually was felt like more effort than the alternative of simply not asking. I grabbed my ladder and toolbox without hesitation and followed her back to her place, a rental 2 doors down that had only had a moving truck parked outside it for about 3 weeks. The fixture turned out to be a simple fix, a loose connection, nothing that required more than 15 minutes and a screwdriver, but Nora hovered nearby the entire time, visibly grateful in the specific, slightly overwhelmed way of someone who'd recently had to relearn how to ask for help after years of not needing to. "You have no idea how much this means," she said, once the hallway light flickered back on, illuminating a stack of still unpacked boxes and a child's drawing taped crookedly to the wall. "I've been putting off calling an electrician for 2 weeks because every quote I got felt like highway robbery, and my ex-husband handled literally every one of these tasks for 18 years, so I'm apparently starting from zero on basic home maintenance at 36 years old. 18 years is a long time to let someone else handle the light bulbs. 18 years is a long time to let someone else handle a lot of things, as it turns out." She said it with the specific dry humor of someone who'd already cried about the subject enough times that it had started, slowly, to become something she could joke about instead. She looked at me, then at the freshly working light, and managed a tired, genuine laugh. "Where were you 18 years ago? I could have used a guy who actually knows how to fix things instead of one who just complained about the cost of hiring someone else to do it." I laughed at that, mostly to cover the specific, unexpected warmth the joke produced in me. 18 years ago, I was 20 and living in a dorm with a roommate who once set our microwave on fire. I don't think I would have been much help. Fair point, I'll allow the 18-year gap in your availability. Here's what you need to know about Nora Voss before anything else happens. She's 36, moved into this rental 3 weeks earlier with her 10-year-old daughter Maddie, after finalizing a divorce that had been 18 years in the making. A marriage that had gone quietly, comprehensively wrong somewhere in the middle without either party quite noticing until the damage was too extensive to repair. She works as a physical therapist at the regional hospital, has a specific, hard-won patience I recognized immediately from watching her handle her daughter's dark hallway anxiety with genuine calm instead of dismissal, and had, by her own admission over that first evening, spent the better part of 2 decades slowly forgetting what it felt like to be anyone's actual priority. She told me that first evening, standing in a hallway still smelling faintly of fresh paint, that the divorce hadn't come from any single dramatic betrayal. No affair, no explosive fight, just 18 years of slow, mutual neglect that had eventually made the marriage feel more like a shared lease than an actual partnership. "We just stopped being curious about each other somewhere around year 6, she said, and neither of us noticed until year 18, when I realized I couldn't remember the last time he'd asked me a real question about my day instead of just reporting his own." That sounds like a particular kind of lonely. Being married and still lonely. It was. I spent a long time thinking that was just what marriage eventually became for everyone, until I finally admitted it wasn't supposed to feel that hollow. She glanced toward Maddie's closed bedroom door. I'm trying to build something different now. Slower, maybe, but actually honest this time. I want to be honest about my own situation because it matters for the rest of this story. I'd been single for the better part of a decade, not entirely by choice, more by a slow accumulation of failed attempts and eventual resignation to a quieter, more solitary life than I'd originally planned on. I'd built a reputation as the reliable neighbor, the guy who showed up with tools and left without expecting anything beyond a thank you. And somewhere along the way, that role had become comfortable enough that I'd stopped examining whether it was actually enough. I want to be clear about what happened next because it matters for how the rest of this went. I did not make a move that first night, or for weeks after it. Nora was 3 weeks into a fresh divorce, visibly still finding her footing, and the absolute last thing I intended to do was let any genuine interest I felt turn into something that looked, even slightly, like taking advantage of a vulnerable moment. I helped when she needed help, a stuck window, a garbage disposal that wouldn't reset, a bookshelf that needed assembling, and I did it the way I'd help any neighbor, careful not to let anything cross into territory that might feel, to a woman freshly out of an 18-year marriage, like pressure she hadn't asked for. You're doing the thing again, my sister told me weeks later, after I'd mentioned Nora's name for what she pointed out was the 4th time in one phone call. The thing where you're clearly interested in someone and spend all your energy making sure they never actually find out. She's 3 weeks out of an 18-year marriage, Deb. I'm not exactly rushing anything. I'm not saying rush. I'm saying eventually you might want to let her know you exist as more than just the neighbor with a ladder. You're doing the thing again, my sister told me weeks later, after I'd mentioned Nora's name for what she pointed out was the 4th time in one phone call. The thing where you're clearly interested in someone and spend all your energy making sure they never actually find out. She's 3 weeks out of an 18-year marriage, Deb. I'm not exactly rushing anything. I'm not saying rush. I'm saying eventually you might want to let her know you exist as more than just the neighbor with a ladder. What if she's not ready for that? What if the timing is genuinely wrong, and I end up being exactly the complication she doesn't need right now? Then you wait a little longer, and you keep being kind without expecting anything, the way you already are. But you don't get to hide behind protecting her forever, Miles. At some point, that just becomes protecting yourself from the risk of her saying no. That's uncomfortably direct. I'm your sister. Directness is part of the job description. I told myself that was a problem for later, that Nora needed space to rebuild before anyone introduced a new variable into her life, and mostly believed it. Right up until the afternoon, Maddie showed up at my door alone, small and serious, holding a broken toy. Mom said you fix things, she informed me, holding up a plastic horse with a snapped leg. Can you fix this one too? I fixed the horse in about 4 minutes with a dab of appropriate glue, and Maddie watched the entire process with the specific rapt attention 10-year-olds bring to anything that looks vaguely like magic. You're really good at fixing stuff, she said. Mom says Dad was never any good at fixing stuff. He just paid people. She says that a lot, actually. Mostly when she thinks I'm not listening. Kids hear more than parents realize, I think. That's what my mom's therapist says, too. I heard that one also. Do you like it here? The new house, I mean. Maddie considered the question with visible seriousness. It's smaller than our old house, but Mom laughs more here, so I think I like it better, actually, even though my room is smaller. That observation stayed with me longer than a 10-year-old's offhand comment probably should have, a small, unguarded window into exactly how much Maddie had been absorbing about her parents' marriage and exactly how much had apparently changed for the better since it ended. I walked Maddie home, glued horse in hand, and found Nora standing in her doorway, equal parts amused and mortified by her daughter's independent field trip. I am so sorry, she said. She's decided you're the neighborhood's official repair wizard, apparently, and has taken to bringing you things without checking with me first. I don't mind. She's good company. Very direct about her opinions on your ex-husband's handyman skills, for the record. Nora's face went slightly pink. I need to work on my filter around her. I didn't realize quite how much she'd been absorbing. For what it's worth, I think it's a healthy thing for her to see. a parent who's honest about hard things instead of pretending everything's fine. She looked at me for a long moment, something shifting behind her expression. Thank you for that. And for the horse, and for basically becoming our unofficial handyman over the past month without ever once making it weird. I try to keep the weirdness to a minimum. It's a personal policy. That comment stayed with me longer than it probably should have, without ever once making it weird. A phrase that felt, on reflection, like both a compliment and a quiet acknowledgement of exactly the careful distance I'd been maintaining. One she'd apparently noticed and, I suspected, appreciated more than she'd said directly. 2 months into this careful, undefined arrangement, I gave Nora a toolbox of her own. A modest but well-stocked kit, the kind of thing I should have thought to offer weeks earlier, along with a promise to teach her the basics so she wouldn't need to rely on me or anyone else for every minor repair. This is either the most practical gift I've ever received, she said, turning the toolbox over in her hands, or the most pointed hint that you're tired of being my emergency contact for broken light fixtures. Neither, actually. I just think you deserve to not need anyone for the small stuff. Independence feels important, given what you're rebuilding. That's a surprisingly thoughtful read on my situation for a man who mostly communicates through fixing things instead of talking about feelings. I contain multitudes. Occasionally, one of them involves actual emotional insight. She laughed at that, and we spent the following Saturday afternoon with her working through a genuinely broken cabinet hinge under my patient supervision, succeeding on her third attempt with a triumphant grin that made something in my chest tighten in a way I'd been trying not to examine too closely for 2 months running. I did it, she announced, holding up the now functional hinge like a trophy. I actually fixed something myself, start to finish, without you doing the hard part while I watched. You did. I'm genuinely impressed. That hinge fought you harder than most of the ones I've dealt with. I'm choosing to interpret that as a compliment about my persistence, rather than a comment on the hinge's poor manufacturing. Both things can be true simultaneously. Over the following weeks, the toolbox lessons became their own small ritual. Saturday afternoons spent working through whatever minor repair the rental house had produced that week, Maddie occasionally supervising from the sidelines with running commentary, the three of us settling into an easy rhythm that felt increasingly like something considerably more permanent than casual neighborly assistance. Our first actual date, separate from Maddie's presence, happened about 3 weeks after the toolbox lessons began. Arranged carefully around a weekend, her father had scheduled visitation. Neither of us called it a date out loud at first, framing it instead as dinner since we're both free, a careful hedge that fooled neither of us but felt safer to maintain until we'd actually tested the waters properly. This feels different than the Saturday repairs, Nora admitted, once we'd been seated at a quiet restaurant 2 towns over, deliberately chosen far enough from our neighborhood that neither of us worried about running into anyone who might read too much into the evening. Good different or nervous different? Both, honestly. I haven't been on an actual date in over 18 years, Miles. I'm considerably rustier at this than I expected to be. I haven't been on many good ones myself, if I'm honest. We can be rusty together. We talked for hours that evening, covering territory we hadn't yet gotten to during Saturday repair sessions. Her actual career ambitions before marriage had reshaped her priorities. My own quiet regrets about a decade spent avoiding real vulnerability in favor of comfortable solitude. The specific, mutual relief of finally being honest with someone about wanting more than either of us had let ourselves ask for in years. I keep waiting for this to feel complicated, she said near the end of the evening. Given everything, the timing, Maddie, the divorce still barely finalized, it just doesn't, though. It feels remarkably simple, which almost makes me more nervous than if it felt hard. Maybe simple is allowed to just be simple sometimes. Not everything good has to come with complications attached. I'm not used to trusting that particular idea yet. 18 years taught me to expect the complications eventually. Then let me be patient while you learn to trust it. I'm not going anywhere. Everything shifted about a week later when Nora's ex-husband, Derek, showed up unannounced on her doorstep on a Tuesday evening, an event I only learned about because I happened to be walking past on my way home and noticed an unfamiliar car in her driveway. staying considerably longer than a simple pickup or drop-off would require. I told myself it wasn't my business, that Derek was still Maddie's father and had every right to visit, and spent an uncomfortable evening trying not to read too much into a parked car that was, after all, none of my concern. That resolve lasted until my phone rang around 10. Nora called me that same night, voice carrying a specific unsettled quality I hadn't heard from her before. "Derek came by," she said, without much preamble. "He wants to talk about reconciling. Not because he suddenly realized he loves me. He was fairly upfront about that part. He's struggling financially since the divorce, missing the household we used to run together, and apparently decided the practical math of getting back together made more sense than staying apart. He actually used the phrase complete family for Maddie at one point. Like that alone should settle the matter." "What did you tell him?" I told him I needed to think about it, which I immediately regretted, because there's genuinely nothing to think about. But then I hung up and sat in my kitchen for 2 hours anyway, because some exhausted, guilty part of me kept circling back to Maddie, and whether I owe her the attempt at a complete family, even a hollow one, over whatever I actually want for myself. "Did he mention anything about how the marriage had actually felt for you? The 18 years of not being asked a real question?" "No, that's exactly the problem, Miles. He talked entirely about logistics, shared expenses, Maddie's stability, how much easier co-parenting would be under one roof. Not once did he mention actually wanting to be curious about me again, or fixing the thing that broke in the first place. He just wants the arrangement back, not the marriage itself repaired." I felt something cold settle in my chest, understanding immediately the specific danger of that particular circling. "Nora, a hollow complete family isn't actually better for Maddie than an honest single one. You know that. Probably better than I do, given you lived inside the hollow version for 18 years. I know that logically. I'm having a harder time feeling it emotionally, especially at 11 at night when the house feels too quiet and the guilt gets loud. What does Maddie actually need, do you think? Not what Derek's framing says she needs, what you actually believe as her mother. She needs a home that doesn't feel like two people quietly performing partnership for her benefit. She told me a few weeks ago, completely unprompted, that Mom laughs more here than she did in our old house. I don't think going back to Derek gives her more of that laughing. I think it just gives her the appearance of stability wrapped around the same hollow center. That sounds like you already know the answer. I think I do. I'm just scared of being the one who chose to keep her family broken instead of fixed, even if the fixed version was never actually real. I didn't push further that night, mostly because I understood, with real clarity, that this wasn't actually my decision to weigh in on, however much the conversation had rattled something loose in my own chest. I told her I was there if she needed to talk further, and let the silence that followed sit exactly where it needed to. I didn't hear from her for 4 days after that call. 4 days of genuine uncertainty about which direction her decision was heading. 4 days where I caught myself watching for her car in the driveway with a specific anxious attention I hadn't felt in years. I went about my usual routine, fixed a neighbor's fence 2 streets over, kept myself occupied with the specific busy work of a man trying not to think too hard about something he had no actual control over, and failed at that project considerably more often than I succeeded. She showed up at my door on the 5th evening, Maddie noticeably absent, holding the toolbox I'd given her weeks earlier. "I need to return this," she said, and for one terrible second I thought she meant it as a symbolic ending, a clean break before reconciling with Derek. "Temporarily. The garbage disposal's making a sound I don't recognize, and I've exhausted my current skill level trying to diagnose it myself." Relief hit me harder than I expected. That's an entirely different kind of emergency than I was bracing for. "What were you bracing for? I thought you might be here to tell me you're going back to Derek." Nora set the toolbox down on my porch step, something steady settling into her expression. "I'm not going back to Derek. I sat with that decision for 4 days, mostly because I needed to make sure I was choosing it for the right reasons, not just reacting against his proposal out of spite. But no, I'm not interested in rebuilding a hollow version of a family just because it photographs better than the honest, smaller version I'm actually building now. I'm glad, for what it's worth. I know you are. I could tell, actually, on the phone that night. You didn't push, but I could hear how much you wanted to. I was trying very hard not to make your decision about my own feelings. I noticed that too. It's actually part of what made the decision easier, if I'm honest. Derek's version of partnership always centered his own convenience. You've spent 2 months centering mine without once asking for anything in return. That contrast got very clear, very fast, once I actually sat with it. She sat down on my porch step, still visibly working through the last 4 days' worth of processing, and I sat beside her, close enough to feel the specific charged quiet of a conversation that had been building for considerably longer than either of us had let ourselves acknowledge directly. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Why didn't you say anything sooner about how you felt? You've had months of opportunities." "Because I was terrified of being exactly the complication you didn't need. You'd just survived 18 years of a marriage that quietly failed you, and I didn't want to be one more person asking something of you before you'd even finished catching your breath." That's a very generous kind of restraint. It didn't always feel generous. Mostly it felt like watching someone I cared about from a careful, frustrating distance and hoping the timing would eventually make sense. The timing makes sense now. I'd like that on the record, in case you were planning on continuing the restraint indefinitely. I want to be honest about what happened next because it's the part of this story I've replayed most since. Standing on my porch, garbage disposal problem entirely forgotten, I finally said the thing I'd been carefully not saying for 2 months. "I like you, Nora. Considerably more than a neighbor should, probably. I've been careful about it because I didn't want you to feel pressured while you were still finding your footing. But I don't think I can keep pretending that carefulness is the same thing as not feeling it. I know, I've known for a while, honestly. I think some part of me has been waiting to feel steady enough to actually let myself want it back. And now? Now feels considerably steadier than 4 days ago." She stepped closer, something warm and certain replacing the earlier uncertainty. 18 years ago, I made a decision I spent most of 2 decades quietly regretting. I'd like to make a better one this time, if you're actually offering. I'm offering. The kiss that followed started careful. The specific careful of 2 people who'd spent 2 months building toward exactly this moment without either of us rushing the landing. Then it went warm, her hand finding the front of my shirt with a certainty that erased whatever hesitation either of us had carried onto that porch. And then, for one long, unhurried moment, it went past warm entirely, into something that made an ordinary Tuesday evening feel like exactly the right place for 18 years of waiting to finally resolve itself. We broke apart to the sound of Maddie's voice calling from down the street, returning from a friend's house with the specific, perfect comedic timing children seem to specialize in. "Were you guys kissing?" she asked, arriving breathless and delighted by her own detective work. "We were," Nora said, laughing, entirely unbothered by the audience. "Is that a problem?" Maddie considered this with the specific gravity 10-year-olds bring to their most serious pronouncements. "No. He fixes stuff and doesn't yell like Dad used to. I approve." "High praise," I said. "I'll take it." We didn't rush what came after that. We dated properly for over a year, deliberate about building something steady for Maddie's sake as much as our own. Both of us aware that the 18 years Nora had lost deserved a foundation that wasn't built on convenience or urgency, but on something considerably more patient. We took things slowly by design. Maddie's comfort came first in every decision, both of us agreeing early on not to introduce any sense of urgency into a life that had already absorbed enough sudden change. I started joining them for occasional dinners, careful never to overstep into a parental role that wasn't mine to claim, letting Maddie set her own pace for how much space I occupied in her daily life. "You're good with her," Nora told me about 6 months in, watching me help Maddie with a school project that had turned into an elaborate cardboard castle spanning most of her kitchen table. "Patient. You don't try to be her dad. You just show up as yourself consistently and let her decide how much room to give you." I'm not trying to replace anything. I just like spending time with both of you. I know, that's exactly why it's working. I proposed 2 years after that first light bulb in Nora's hallway, in the exact spot where I'd fixed that original fixture, holding a ring and the same toolbox I'd once given her, now considerably more worn from genuine use. I'd planned it carefully, arranging with Maddie in advance to have a light emergency that evening, a bulb I'd deliberately loosened earlier that week, giving myself the excuse to be standing in that exact hallway when I finally asked the question I'd been building toward for months. "This feels appropriately symmetrical," she said, once she'd said yes, laughing and crying simultaneously in the same hallway where this entire story had started. The light fixture, the toolbox, all of it circling back to exactly where it began. I like a story that closes its own loop properly. You planned this, didn't you? The bulb wasn't actually broken. I loosened it myself 3 days ago. I wanted the location to be exact, not just approximate. That's either extremely romantic or a mild form of fraud against my electrical system. I'll take romantic. The alternative carries considerably worse legal implications. We got married the following spring, Maddie serving as flower girl and, by her own insistence, official toolbox inspector, a title she took with tremendous seriousness throughout the entire ceremony, patrolling the reception with a small toy toolbox, checking that everything was, in her words, properly fixed. Derek attended, considerably more gracious than either of us expected, having found his own footing in the intervening years with someone better suited to what he'd actually wanted rather than what convenience had briefly suggested. I got to see Nora handle real pressure again about a year into our marriage, when a genuine electrical emergency struck her hospital's physical therapy wing during a particularly busy shift, a power failure that threatened to disrupt care for several patients mid-treatment. I happened to be dropping off her forgotten lunch when the crisis unfolded, and watched her calmly redirect an entire wing's workflow, prioritizing patients by need, coordinating with facilities management with the same patient competence I'd first noticed years earlier, fixing a stubborn cabinet hinge. "You're terrifyingly organized under pressure," I told her, once the emergency had passed and power had been restored. 18 years of managing a household that quietly fell apart taught me a lot about staying calm while things break around you, apparently. Might as well put the skill to good use somewhere it actually matters. I don't think you know how to do anything halfway. You should see me attempt small talk at hospital fundraisers, deeply, embarrassingly halfway on that front. The original toolbox sits in our shared garage now, considerably fuller than the modest starter kit I'd first given Nora, expanded steadily over years of genuine use as her own skills grew alongside our relationship. Maddie, 13 now, has started borrowing tools from it herself, tackling small repairs around the house with the same patient confidence her mother eventually developed. "Still can't believe you two started with a broken light bulb," Maddie said recently, watching us both work through a genuinely stubborn kitchen faucet repair together. "That's like the least romantic beginning I've ever heard." "Romance shows up in strange packaging sometimes," Nora told her. "Sometimes it's a light bulb. Sometimes it's a man who fixes your kid's broken toy horse without being asked." 18 years too late for the light bulb joke, though, Mom. You've told that story 100 times. It's a good story. I intend to keep telling it. My sister came to visit last month, meeting Nora and Maddie properly for the first time, and spent most of the weekend with the specific satisfied expression of a woman watching a prediction finally come true. "I told you," she said, cornering me in the kitchen while Nora and Maddie were occupied elsewhere. "The thing where you're interested in someone and hide it. I called this exact outcome months before you ever admitted anything to me directly. You called that I'd eventually stop hiding it. You didn't call the light bulb or the toolbox or any of the actual specifics." "Details, Miles. I called the shape of it. That's what matters. I'm choosing not to argue, mostly because you're right and I'd rather not encourage you further." Maddie, for her part, has started introducing me to her friends as my mom's husband who fixes stuff, a title she delivers with the same seriousness she brought to inspecting our wedding reception. and one I've come to consider the single best description of myself I've ever been given, considerably better than any I'd have come up with on my own. Nora still keeps the original toolbox separate from the one we use daily now, tucked on a high shelf in the garage, insisting it stays exactly as I first gave it to her, modest and slightly worn even from those early months of practice. "That one's not for using anymore," she told me once when I asked why she'd retired a perfectly functional set of tools. "That one's just for remembering. Some things earn the right to just sit there and mean something instead of staying useful." I think about that first evening sometimes, the specific, ordinary accident of a broken light fixture in a hallway I'd never before had reason to visit. I had no idea, standing on a borrowed ladder fixing a loose connection, that I was about to spend the next several years slowly, carefully building a life with the woman watching from below. No idea that her tired, half-joking question about where I'd been 18 years earlier would turn out to have an answer neither of us could have predicted that first night. Waiting, apparently, exactly where I was supposed to be, until the timing finally caught up to both of us. What would you have done if a simple favor for a neighbor turned out to be exactly what you'd been waiting 18 years to find? Tell me your story in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.